Hi everyone, welcome to the lecture series on Brown's 14 grammatical morphemes. So Brown's 14 morphemes comes from the work of Roger Brown, who was a social psychology professor at Harvard, and he was interested in what children's grammars are like and how children eventually achieve adult grammars. And so to investigate this, he and his students did a longitudinal study, and they had originally 2 participants who they began looking at when they were a year and a half old and followed them up to 4 years of age. And he gave these 2 children the pseudonyms Adam and Eve. And he and his students would go into their homes every 2 weeks and record a language sample of the children talking with their parents. And then eventually they added a 3rd child to the study, who they gave the pseudonym Sarah, and they collected language samples from her on a weekly basis. So they did this for 3.5 years, and then they went back to the lab and typed up the transcripts of the language samples and analyzed these samples with the goal of being able to describe the grammatical knowledge underlying the speech that these children were producing. And so through this analyzing, Roger Brown identified 14 morphemes which could be associated with grammatical growth and with sentence length. And he selected these morphemes based on frequency of occurrence. So it was important that the morphemes occurred frequently enough that they had enough context to analyze. And then the second criteria was that they each had an identifiable obligatory context. So an obligatory context is when a certain grammatical structure, like a morpheme, is required to make the sentence grammatical. So in this example, last night I studied for the test. We can say that that is an obligatory context for the past tense ed morpheme. And in the second sentence where it's left out, last night I studied for the test, that would also be an obligatory context. So both of these sentences contain an obligatory context for the regular past tense ed morpheme. In the first sentence it was included, and then in the second sentence it was not included, but should have been. And then that asterisk at the first of the sentence denotes that that is an ungrammatical sentence. Okay, so not all morphemes have identifiable or easily identifiable obligatory contexts. So if we look at the superlative morpheme, or the EST in biggest, we can look at the example, the first example, I want the big piece of pie, and the second example, I want the biggest piece of pie. And both sentences are grammatical. So in the first sentence, we don't really know if that EST should have been included, right, unless we knew that they were going to say that and didn't. So this shows an example of how some morphemes, their inclusion or leaving them out does not result in an ungrammatical sentence, which leads us to an obligatory context that's not easily identifiable. So Roger Brown made sure that the 14 morphemes he selected all had identifiable obligatory contexts and were all produced with enough frequency to be able to look at these. And using the language samples collected from the 3 children, he calculated the percentage of correct uses for each of these specific morphemes. So every time there was an obligatory context would be the denominator, and then every time it was included would be the numerator, and then you could get a percent of inclusion. And then this percentage can be tracked over time to measure grammatical progress in a child. So the types of morphemes that made his list, there's inflectional morphemes, both ones that go on nouns and verbs, and there are grammatical morphemes, including prepositions, articles, and copula and auxiliary be. The ones that didn't make the list, like adjective inflections, past participle, derivational morphemes, and other types of auxiliaries didn't make the list, like I said earlier, because they either didn't have an easily identifiable obligatory context or they just didn't occur with enough frequency in everyday speech to be used as a good measure. So here is the list of the 14 morphemes, and I'm going to go over each one of these in the next 3 videos. And I've split them up into sections. So in the next video, we'll go over the first 5. And these are the structures that can be associated with nouns. And then the next 5 have to do with verbs. And then in the last video, we'll go over the final 4, which are all forms of the verb to be.